On the 26th of November 1539, Abbot Marmaduke Bradley signed the deed of surrender that handed over Fountains Abbey and all its lands to King Henry VIII. At the stroke of a quill pen, he ended 408 years of continuous monastic life. Within a year, the great roof timbers of the monastery had been carted away, the lead melted down, the window glass carried off to other churches. Fountains Abbey was now just a gaunt ruin, a relic of a lost past. Before the dissolution, Britain had been a divided land. 2/3 of the island was controlled by the castles that belonged to the king and the nobility. The other third was dominated by the monasteries. This is the story of the lost world of medieval Britain. In 1282, the Welsh Prince Llewellyn rose up against the English in a guerrilla war. Retaliation was swift and violent. What happened here created the Britain that we know today. King Edward I had a vision of himself. He saw himself as King Arthur, the king of all Britain, not just the King of England. And Edward spent much of his reign trying to make this dream, this vision, into a reality. And he started here in Wales by suppressing the rebellion of the Welsh prince Llewellyn ap Griffith. His victory over the Welsh led to an extraordinary building campaign, the largest and most dynamic since the Norman Conquest. A ring of castles around the Welsh stronghold of Snowdonia. And in that ring of castles, one stood out amongst all others as being the most important, the most powerful, and the most symbolic. And it was here, at Carnarvon. Carnarvon wasn't just the largest of Edward's new castles. It was also intended to be the seat of a new English Prince of Wales. But this castle was different and, remarkably, was modelled on the imperial Roman walls of Constantinople. Why would an English king want to copy the buildings of the Roman Empire? So you've kindly brought with you this photograph of the walls at Constantinople, modern Istanbul. And obviously the reason you've done that is because it explains what we've got here.
There are two features that really stand out. First of all, the fact that the towers are polygonal. Also, you've got this really interesting banding, masonry banding along the walls. So, an amazing level of similarity between those two places.
It is extraordinary that he's looking back to imperial Rome to inspire this most important of all his Welsh castles.
I think what Edward's doing, he's grabbing hold, he's sort of manipulating symbols of imperial Roman authority.
Carnarvon Castle was far more than just a symbol of Edward's kingship or of English domination. It was a magnificent war machine. It was designed by the best architects and engineers of their day. This external wall, 18 foot thick, is honeycombed with passages which allowed archers and other troops to rush to any point of the castle that was being attacked. Edward I was interested in building more than just castles. Carnarvon was to be a capital, a political, administrative and judicial centre. He also hoped it would be commercially successful, populated by English merchants. What he was trying to do was to create an English political, social and military enclave in the heart of Wales. Edward built 4 other castles, each a day's march from the other, to keep a lid on the Welsh resistance. They were all at the cutting edge of international military technology. Here, at Harlech, to penetrate the gatehouse, the attacker had to overcome 3 portcullises. All the while, scalding water would have been raining down on him through many murder holes. Even though the Welsh never let up their resistance, they could never expel the English. Edward's castles had done their job. For a brief period around 1300, King Edward I was genuinely the King of Britain. But although in many ways he'd solved the issue of England's relationship with Wales, the issue of Scotland was far more difficult. For 300 years, the Scottish borders remained an area of disorder and chaos. Out of this disorder came a different and unique type of castle. Not the massive castles of the state, but the privately built fortified houses of the border lords. Stephen Parisian is in the Lake District, discovering what terrors provoked the building of the 6-foot-thick walls of Dacre Castle.
This may look like a very chocolate boxy view today, but in the 14th century, this part of Cumbria was like the Afghan frontier. Cross-border raids were endemic. You never knew where the next threat was coming from. In response to that turbulence and uncertainty, a very distinctive building type was evolved, exemplified here at Dacre Castle. John, it really was a very turbulent time in the late 14th century, wasn't it? How did that relate to the castle here?
We could liken it to Kosovo or Bosnia. It was a constant intestine feuding between the English and the Scots and between various families on both sides. So this tower would at one time be surrounded, probably along the level of the high ground here, by a timber fence or palisade, a bit like a Wild West fort. The Scots used northern England as a bank. They extorted money at every opportunity from the northern English to carry on the war against the southern English.
The money paid to these Scots was called blackmail, I believe. That's the origin of the term.
That's exactly right. Obviously, Lord Dacre would have a number of tenants and they would pay him rent. At the same time, those tenants would be paying blackmail or black rent to the Scots to keep the Scots off their back. And it was a highly organised system.
But if you didn't pay your black rent or blackmail, then what would happen?
Something very unpleasant could happen to you. Your cattle would disappear. Your crops, if you had planted any, might be burned down. Your house, your bothy might be burned down. And ultimately, if you went on long enough, well, somebody might just have to come and cut your throat. So this is the spiral staircase built into the thickness of the wall. And the twist is designed to favour, say, a right-handed swordsman if he had to retreat upwards with the Scots pursuing him if they'd broken into the basement. Because, of course, he was a left-handed swordsman, in which case the twist on the spiral stair would be the other way around. But you can see just how carefully engineered it is.
Well, here we are in the solar, and gosh, John, these walls are immensely thick, aren't they? What about 6 foot from front to back?
Oh, at least, I would say. The walls, of course, were built with that thickness because this wasn't just a house, it was a fort. These walls had to resist an attack, a serious and determined attack by the Scots, who could, of course, drop by literally at any time.
Because, of course, that's the ultimate irony, isn't it? That when James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, those raids largely ceased, so these big, thick walls were an anachronism.
Gentlemen continued living in their fortified towers for some time after the union of the crowns, because you never knew with the Scots, things might just turn nasty again, therefore it was just a world to box clever, as they say. So these walls remained quite a useful insurance for a few years after 1603.
The border castles acted as a sort of buffer zone, leaving the rest of England and Wales to enjoy relative peace. One monastery in particular benefited from this increasing stability, expanding its estates from coast to coast across northern England. In the middle of the 12th century, something extraordinary happened here on the wild moors of North Yorkshire. In 1132, 13 disgruntled monks left their monastery in York and came here to this remote valley in North Yorkshire. They wanted to found a new Cistercian monastery where they could live a purer and more simple life. Their first winter here must have been pretty ghastly. They sheltered under trees and allegedly had to boil bark for food. But 350 years later, that simple community had transformed itself into the richest, largest, and I think most beautiful monastery in England. It was Fountains Abbey. To appreciate just how remote the monastery is, you have to see it from the air. One of the really important reasons for siting the monastery where it was is that it's on a river valley, so you've got water power, you've got water to drink. I mean, it's the ideal location, really.
Well, yes, the drinking water came from springs, hence the name Fountains, you see, because you had to have a separate water supply. You wouldn't use the water from a river because it could be contaminated with people dumping latrine waste in it.
Before Fountains, the river valley had been a wilderness. But that was how the Cistercians liked it. They turned their back on civilization. They reclaimed the wilderness for God. And they lived an austere and disciplined life. Their first buildings here reflected that simple motivation. It is incredibly simple, and I really like the way this little chamfer comes round and comes wide at the bottom. And this building was their dormitory, and life in there was sort of horrifically simple, really.
They were sleeping on the wooden floor with straw mattresses, the monks and the abbot together.
But this simplicity didn't last for long. The monastery began to expand and prosper. It needed more space for the hundreds of lay monks that farmed the fields and tended the 12,000 sheep owned by the abbey. So they built a huge new dormitory, diverting the river by 26 metres to make space for the buildings. Even if you've seen lots and lots of abbeys, you can't help but be impressed by the sheer scale of this dormitory.
It's an absolute monster in size. In the late 12th century, the number of lay brothers swelled tremendously, and they knocked down the early range and built this great building, the largest one of its kind in England.
Is it possible to calculate how many people would have slept in here, do you think?
Well, I did a calculation allowing so much space for beds or mattresses.
And it came out at what?
Around about 200.
Yeah, that's a lot of people, isn't it?
It is, yes.
I don't know whether you've noticed that every time you end up visiting a monastery, you end up looking at the lavatories, because they're almost the most interesting bit.
We do, yes. This is the great latrine that served the lay brothers' dormitory. Obviously, with 200 men living in here, you had to have a pretty huge lavatory for them to use. And here they've actually built the latrine over the river.
And this one's on 2 levels, isn't it?
On the south side, there's a series of arches with ground floor single cubicles for day use. But on a night, they would come here and there would be 2 rows of seats down, because there's two river channels, 2 rows of seats over those channels. So there'd probably be about 50 seats in here.
So it's quite cosy if everyone decided to go at once.
Oh, yes.
And to be absolutely quite clear about this, when they were sitting above each other, it wasn't like this, were
No,
they? They were staggered.
They were staggered, yes.
The simplicity and the holiness of the lives of the monks who lived here led in due course to them receiving massive donations and bequests. In fact, in a few years, Fountains Abbey became one of the richest monasteries in Britain. And money led to architecture and the construction of buildings that would have almost certainly appalled the first monks who came here in the 12th century. So this is really still incredibly simple, isn't it?
It is a simple building, but it's slightly more elaborate than the earliest buildings. This is the second church on the site.
And it's a very, very long building.
It is. It's 11 bays or 11 arches in length. And this was because it had to accommodate 2 separate sets of choir stalls, one for the monks at the east end and an even larger one for the lay brothers at the west end.
In the 15th century, the east window of the church was replaced in the latest, most fashionable and extravagant style.
This had certain advantages because it had nice rectangular panelled lights in it in which you could display images of saints, but you could also display the arms of the patrons of the abbey.
You see, I like that very much because what it shows is how money and the architectural elaboration and beautification of this place went hand in hand. It was private patronage, people trying to get close to God by investing in architecture.
Yeah, exactly.
In medieval society, everyone was desperately concerned as to what was going to happen to their souls when they died. And although it seems incredibly unfair to us today, the rich had a greater opportunity to influence the outcome than the poor. And one of the crucial ways in which they got themselves an insurance policy to get to heaven and get out of purgatory was by giving money and giving land to the monasteries. But the wealth of the monasteries didn't just come from the pockets of the rich. Monasteries became significant money-making businesses in their own right. But how did the business side of these spiritual organisations operate? Ed McCann is in Wiltshire on a mission to discover how the monasteries exploited their massive estates.
During the dissolution of the monasteries, on the 23rd of March 1539, Elizabeth Zouche, who is the abbess of Shaftesbury, signs a deed of surrender and gives it to King Henry's men. Everything you can see way over the horizon ends up in King Henry's coffers. Now, the Abbey Church was the centre of the monastic community, and after dissolution, and unlike at Fountains Abbey, Shaftesbury Abbey has to go. And in a kind of nice bit of 16th century recycling, as they take it apart, they use it to build the town of Shaftesbury. Unfortunately for us, what this means is there's really not much left. The Abbey may be little more than a pile of rubble, but here at Bradford-on-Avon, 27 miles from Shaftesbury, we find a building owned by the Abbey and in pristine condition. Now, they say you can tell a lot about an abbey from the size of its barns, and by the standards of the day, this one was bloody enormous. The barn has huge cathedral-like buttresses, not surprising really, as the day job of the people who built it was probably cathedral building. But to my highly critical eye, whoever built this porch was either drunk or incompetent. This is actually a drunken porch, isn't it? Because that is definitely skew.
It is, yeah. Why is that, do you think?
They've had a problem during construction here. If you look at the upper arch there,
Yeah.
it's flattened out very substantially. And I think what's happened is when they've taken the centering out, this buttress is given, this is settled down, and as a remedy, they've put in the lower arch, and I think they've put in the wedge-shaped blocks and then built up from there.
So it's actually during construction it's gone wrong?
I'd bet money on it, actually. I'd bet your money on it.
So much for cathedral builders. Then.
Yeah, no, they needed barn lessons.
So the carts come in through the main porch onto the threshing floor of this.
Wow, that is quite a roof, isn't it?
It's brilliant.
And is that original?
Yeah, it's been scientifically dated to the mid-14th century.
The Grange at Bradford-on-Avon was a component of the corporate business that was Shaftesbury Abbey. Produce from the farms surrounding the Grange would be fed into the cistern via the barn.
The carts would come in one by one during the harvest from the fields. They would come in here onto the threshing floor and be offloaded. This would be raw sheaves we're talking about, so just stacked into these areas here. Once the harvest is over, the barn flips into distribution mode. And when we get orders coming in from Shaftesbury Abbey for 500 bushels of wheat or whatever it might be, then the wheat is taken off the pile, thresh it on the threshing floor
so
here.
They just hit it here?
Yeah, they hit it here. Get rid of the stalks and all the rest of the rubbish. Grain's put in sacks, sacks are loaded onto carts, and convoys head off down towards Shaftesbury.
It's like a modern packaging and distribution warehouse, isn't it?
It's exactly like that, yeah.
To understand the barn, You have to see it in relation to the landscape around it.
This is just one item in a complex, a carefully planned complex which makes up the Grange. That is the porch of another lost barn, so it should look like that, running down there, and that's for the cattle, we think. On this side, we've got the manor house itself, which is the head office of the regional headquarters that you were talking about earlier. Inside there were offices for the steward, the bailiff, the reeve, the hayward, the shepherds, the people who actually made this whole manor function. And then they had access, of course, to the town of Bradford and the marketplace. The abbess held the rights to the marketplace. So she had the retail outlet as well as the distribution depot.
She's got it stitched up, hasn't she?
Absolutely.
Well, I'd always imagined that life in medieval Britain in the rural areas would have been sort of based around little cottages and people spinning and doing things like this. And actually you realise when you see these sort of things, it wasn't like that at all, or for lots of people it wasn't like that. These are industrial, corporate scale operations going on all over the country. I mean, there's a dozen of these on Shaftesbury, and there are 800 Shaftesburys knocking around the country. And it's astonishing to me, really, that, you know, in hundreds and hundreds of years before the Industrial Revolution, we see industrial buildings, industrial processes, and what looks very like a sort of 20th century corporate structure.
It would be quite wrong of us to think of a monastery as a building that sort of sat isolated in a field in glorious isolation. Yes, originally they may have been built to be like that, but they did rely on these enormous landholdings, and they became very successful and very powerful economic corporations. By the 1520s, Henry VIII began to cast an envious eye on this enormous wealth. The dissolution of the monasteries was at hand. In February 1535, Henry's officials conducted an investigation into the conduct of the monks at Fountains. They found several instances of immorality. They fabricated allegations, including sodomy, child abuse, and gluttony. Fountains and its estates, along with around 800 other monasteries across Britain, were taken over by the Crown. The age of the monasteries was truly over. But what happened at Fountains after the dissolution? One of the things I find so interesting about the dissolution of the monasteries is that there were a whole series of big decisions that had to be made about buildings like this. Were they going to be kept and turned into cathedrals, or were they going to be demolished? And there was a big debate about Fountains, wasn't there?
There was. In fact, it was scheduled to become a cathedral. And the abbey was mothballed for about 9 months after the monks were thrown out. And in the end, Chester Abbey was made a cathedral instead. So Fountains then came on the market for stripping out all the buildings.
So then there was really a question of saying, right, what's valuable here?
What they did was they strip all the lead off the roof and melt that down. They were burning the choir stalls and the furniture to feed the furnaces for melting the lead.
So they took out all the easy stuff, the timber and the lead and the glass, but when they were faced with the stonework, I mean, they were snookered, really, because it's so far from anywhere that they weren't really able to make proper use of it, which, of course, is why so much survives.
Exactly, but the one thing they did do was that they pulled one of the piers of the central tower down and felled it, and that brought the arcades of the presbytery down, and that meant the church was never able to be reused.
And that just brings us on to the great bell tower, which, in a way, it's one of the most sort of potent and, I don't know, sort of emotional pieces of architecture for me, because it's a period that I love very much. I think it's a very, very beautiful structure, very plain, very elegant. And the men who built that were still around as the rest of the abbey was being demolished. It was only been finished for just over 10 years, 15 years.
15 years, yes, at the most.
I mean, it must have been terrible for them.
It must have been devastating for the monks, the community, and all their tenants and servants when the monks were pensioned off and the abbey was stripped of everything of value. Absolutely heartbreaking.
The dissolution of the monasteries was a cultural and artistic and architectural catastrophe. You can't go to somewhere like Fountains without wanting to weep tears. The illuminated manuscripts, the wall paintings, the soaring arches, the spires, the stained glass, it was all thrown away. And I believe, at least, that this nation is impoverished as a result of that. But did the dissolution destroy the great legacy of places like Fountains? Well, the answer is almost, but not quite. Before the dissolution, Norwich Cathedral was a monastery much like Fountains Abbey. But it survived. What happened here on the 2nd of May 1538 was light years away from the cataclysmic destruction that had hit Fountains Abbey. When the prior and his monks woke up, they found that their great monastery and all that went with it had gone, but they were still the custodians of one of England's greatest cathedrals. Henry VIII stripped Norwich of its huge landed wealth and dismantled many of its buildings. But the cloisters, the second largest in Britain, and the cathedral itself survived. There were around 800 monasteries at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign. By the time of his death, only 16 of them remained. Of those 16, 8 were already cathedrals. And what that meant was that all that had to happen was that the monasteries were dissolved and the cathedrals could be retained, just as here at Norwich. Then Henry VIII decided to create 6 more new cathedrals in towns where there weren't great churches, such as Peterborough and Oxford. And finally, he created 2 new colleges. But apart from those 16, the entire monastic civilization that had grown up in England over 600 years was swept away in the lifetime of a single man. When Henry VIII had finished with the Benedictine Priory of Norwich, it was pretty beaten up. But unlike so many other monasteries, it survived the Reformation. But what happened to its great works of literature, culture, and education? Some of these monastic good works were preserved in a chapel right next door to the west end of the cathedral. Norwich was the first of the cathedral monasteries to be dissolved, and there was a question as to what should happen to the monastic school. Henry VIII decided to refound it in 1538, and the monks were to become the teachers, and this beautiful 14th century chapel became the schoolroom. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the dissolution of the monasteries and the coming of Protestantism was one of the key moments that shaped our national history. Henry VIII set out to nationalise the church. He then went on to privatise its assets. And in doing so, he made a small number of courtiers and friends extremely rich. But who was it who stood to make a killing from the dissolution? And where did they come from? Throughout the Middle Ages, the basis of wealth, power, and social status was land. And if you owned a lot of land, the thing you'd want to do is build your house right in the middle of it. For many who were returning from the wars with France, their coffers laden with gold, there was a particular type of house that they wanted to build. It was a type of building that reflected their status as a knight. It was a type of house that we know today as a castle. And houses don't come more castle-like than this, Bodiam Castle in East Sussex, the home of the medieval soldier of fortune, Sir Edward Dallingridge. Dallingridge had a well-deserved violent reputation. He'd made a name for himself pillaging French villages during the 100 Years' War. And I always think of this as the sort of perfect gem-like castle. I had a little castle like this when I was a kid. It is a classic castle, but it is incredibly controversial, isn't it?
It is. It has become enormously controversial, Bodiam. It looks like a perfect castle, but the question is it actually a castle?
Is it an argument about the function of the building, or is it something wider than that?
Scholars have been getting really hot under the collar about whether the defences here were actually functional or not, whether you could drain the moat and cross it easily, whether an attacking force could shoot through the windows and arrow loops, whether the battlements are really thick enough to withstand ballista bolts and stones from catapults. And the other side is really saying whether this is defensible or not, it is a castle because it's the home of a man who fights for his living.
In a way, when you look at him, I mean, he was a thug, he was a bruiser. There's no other sort of building he could possibly live in other than a castle.
He was, and he wants to build a house, above all, that reflects his status in society as a fighter and a knight.
Dallingridge was a military man who had married into incredible wealth. In order to announce to the world that he'd moved up the social scale, he put his wife's coat of arms alongside his above the drawbridge. And, for good measure, he carved his jousting helm up there as well. Jousting was, of course, the sport of knights. So when you get into the castle, it's sort of like a house around a courtyard, isn't it, really?
Yes, very spacious and well appointed. On this side, the chapel, first of all, with its great window, east window, and then Dallingridge's withdrawing apartments on 2 levels, with fireplaces heating the principal chambers.
Dallingridge was using what had originally been genuine defensive elements as fancy decorative features. He even, rather strangely, added battlements to his fireplaces. To me, the key to understanding Bodiam is to look at the way Dallingridge modified the landscape around it. The castle wasn't built in the best defensive position. It is, in fact, nestled amongst low hills. It's got a jousting ground in front of it, and the moat, contrary to being a defensive structure, was really built to reflect the beautiful castle. In all, it's more like an 18th century country house. It's very easy, again, to think of this sort of rather thuggish man, but actually, he wanted to enjoy himself. He wanted to go out there with his wife, and he wanted to hunt, and he wanted to take a turn round the moat and see his castle reflected in it. This was a man who wanted pleasure and luxury.
And the castle expresses, in its landscape and in its architecture, his social identity, function and class.
What was happening at Bodiam wasn't a one-off. It was actually happening all over the country. In the 15th century, castles were objects of desire. Historian Anna Kay is at Caister in Norfolk to investigate one of the most fought-over castles of medieval Britain.
In 1459, John Paston inherited this castle of Caister from his friend and neighbour, Sir John Fastolf. But the inheritance was a contested one, and many other people also laying claim to the castle. Among these was the Duke of Norfolk himself, who actually besieged it. But why would a man like Norfolk, one of the greatest noblemen of the kingdom, want a place like Caister? Now you think of East Anglia as being sort of, slightly out of the way of things, but that wasn't the case at all in the 15th century, was it?
Not at all. East Anglia was one of the most cosmopolitan places in England, and it was very much at a communications hub between the continent, London, and the rest of England.
But the Duke of Norfolk already has a power base in East Anglia, doesn't he?
That's right. His family had a huge ancestral castle at Framlingham in Suffolk, but it was already 300 years old by the mid-15th century. It was cold, it was draughty, and it was unfashionable. And the chance of getting his hands on a brand new, luxurious home at the heart of one of the most important parts of Norfolk was too good to pass up, particularly given that he didn't really have much of an estate in Norfolk itself.
And how does he get away with it? I mean, turning up with 300 men to besiege the property of somebody else is, it's a fairly contentious thing to do, isn't it?
It certainly is, but 1469 gave him the perfect opportunity to do it because the second phase of what we call the Wars of the Roses had just broken out. King Edward IV was under lock and key in one of the castles that belonged to his cousin Warwick the Kingmaker.
So while the king's away, being distracted by other matters, Norfolk's able quietly to take control of Caister.
Exactly.
Gosh. Presumably these were rooms on each floor.
That's right, each one with a fireplace.
So actually, when Norfolk and his 300 men are besieging the castle, I mean, the castle's only part of the story, isn't it? Because it's all of this that he's getting his hands on.
The landscape around us represents enormous wealth because land gave you not only an income but also social status and political power because you controlled the lives of the people who lived and worked on your land.
So really it's a kind of timeless thing, isn't it? I mean, however high you've risen in the ranks of a trade or whatever money you've made, you still ultimately want to turn it into bricks and mortar and fields.
That's right, and that's why it was so fiercely competitive, the entire land market, and why a prize like Caister was so viciously fought over.
Visiting Caister today, you get the impression when you arrive that the castle starts here with the moat, and there are the buildings beyond, and you can see its extent. But when you look more closely at places like Caister, you realise that, in fact, the castle is just a sort of tiny pinprick in the middle of the vast map of the estates that these sorts of buildings controlled. And for people like Falstaff, the Parstons, like Norfolk, it wasn't so much the castle that they were after, because it was really with the land that the power came.
The lords in their castles held absolute power over the peasants who worked their estates. Power that was sometimes abused. Stephen Parisian is at Warham Percy in North Yorkshire.
750 years ago, here in Warham Percy, I would have been in the middle of a thriving community. There would be people using the parish church behind me, people baking bread in the mill over there, next door to the mill pond. Up there, 450 people living cheek by jowl across the hillside. But by the beginning of the 16th century, the whole place was deserted. What happened?
For years, the deserted medieval villages of Britain were thought to have been decimated by the Black Death or plague. But research at this poignant site revealed the community didn't simply die out, neither did they leave of their own accord.
Alec, what looks like a bumpy field on first inspection is, of course, a deserted medieval village. What sort of people were they? Who was here?
In a sense, it's a typical medieval community. You've got the vicar living down there next to the church. You've got a number of free peasants, and you've got the poorer peasants who are actually tied to their landlords. But essentially, they're all living in much the same sort of house. What we're coming to here is the excavated remains of a 14th century peasant longhouse.
What would it have looked like above ground there?
We've walked into the hall area here with the fireplace centrally on the floor there. There would have been a division, a partition running across there which would have divided off the private end of the house.
The hearth served as stove and heat source for an extended family of around 10 people. But life here wasn't primitive. Rich artefacts found by archaeologists revealed that some of the villagers were wealthy by the standards of the day. Some of their possessions wouldn't look out of place in a modern household. But the house wasn't simply home to humans. As farmers, the villagers would have shared their domestic space with their most valuable possession, their livestock, on the other side of that door.
There's probably room for about, 8 or 10 cattle in here. And it's downslope, so the urine and so on is flowing out into the street below.
Right. Still pretty smelly, though, I imagine.
Very smelly, but also, they're providing some warmth, these cattle, so there's advantages as well as disadvantages.
Well, let's follow the line of the poo.
But by the end of the 15th century, Warren Percy was deserted. What was going on?
How did the village come to die?
I think you can pin the explanation down in a single word to sheep.
So sheep are simply more profitable than peasant farming.
That's right. By the beginning of the 16th century, peasants, agricultural labourers, bring in next to no income for the landlord, whereas wool brings in a lot of money. And you only need one shepherd to look after all those sheep, of course, as well.
But what happens to those peasants who are turfed out of Warren Percy? Where do they go?
I think it's almost impossible for us today to conceive of how bad things must have been for peasants in that situation. I mean, it must have been just like a trapdoor opening underneath you. And without your land, you have no support whatsoever. You've lived here all your life, you know nothing beyond the horizons of this village, and suddenly you're told, no, you can't be here any longer. You're just a nobody. You have no purpose, no livelihood, no identity, really.
Grim stuff.
Grim.
The fate of Warren Percy, wiped out in a matter of decades through really a cold decision of economics, shows how much power the nobility had over their estates and the people who worked on them. For the landlords, it was a simple question of economics, sheep over small holdings. For the peasants, it was a matter of life or death.
The vast wealth generated by the demolition of places like Warren Percy fed a late medieval building frenzy that saw castles turning into something completely new. As they continued to successfully exploit their great estates, the nobility built ever more elaborate castles. Hurstmonceux in Sussex was built by the Fiennes family in beautiful but fragile brick, hardly the sort of material you would choose for a defensive building. One of the things that sets us apart from the continent is the relative stability, the relative lack of terrible violence. And we're an island, we're not being endlessly invaded. And that's a fundamental factor behind our architecture, isn't it?
I think it does have a large part to play, and let's face it, looking at this building, we're looking at a work of display architecture. Just as at Bodiam, we've got the family coat of arms at the top. And what would have struck a 15th century audience, beyond all else when they arrived here, were the materials used here. Brick, it seems so common to us today, but this fantastic rich red brick. And these fascinating patterns. This is the most fashionable material of the 1440s, and it's going to revolutionise English architecture.
But we are looking at a con here as well, aren't we? I mean, looking at those arrow loops and those gun ports, and they're laughable. I mean, if you were in the 13th century and came and looked at those, you'd laugh. While Hurstmonceux would have crumbled if attacked by a properly equipped army, the fortifications have to be understood in terms of the threat they were built to withstand. And in 15th century England, they were unlikely to face more than relatively small-scale disorder. Hurstmonceux would have easily coped with a threat posed by a peasant mob armed with pitchforks and scythes. The original interior of Hurstmonceux was destroyed in the 18th century when the site was used as a brick quarry for other buildings on the estate. But luckily, paintings were made before its destruction, enabling us to piece together the lost interior of this very important building.
When you came into the house, when you walked through the gatehouse, this is what a medieval visitor would have seen. A large courtyard laid out with a cloister, and in the far distance, the Great Hall. You can just see the door into the Great Hall in the corner there.
And the Great Hall, you can see, it's the only interior that we know anything about, isn't it, really?
This is a classic English Great Hall, covered by a high open timber ceiling with a screen dividing the services from the main body of the hall. You can also note very interesting detail, these high cornices. Below those, the walls would have been hung with tapestries, so the windows have been raised up, not to get in the way.
And these beasts here, more of these heraldic beasts, such as the ones you see on
the front of the main
outside.
gate. It's a very charming detail. And notice they're all facing the high table of the interior, as if paying deference to Roger Fines when he appears to dine here.
I suppose it's very interesting because it is a very eccentric building, but on the other hand, in some ways it does anticipate what you get with the Tudors and the Elizabethans.
In its use of brick, in its integration of design, it anticipates so many things that are going to be developed and seen again in the Tudor period and afterwards.
The nobility who lived in the castles of Britain were to do very well out of the dissolution of the monasteries. The transfer of monastic lands through the crown to the aristocracy was a phenomenal change in everyone's lives. It quite literally redrew the map of England. The wealth of the monasteries had become privatised, but so had the creative energy that had built them. Now architectural innovation lay not with the church, but with the crown and the aristocracy. Instead of building in the old-fashioned castle style of Carnarvon and Bodiam, the super-rich wanted to build something new. The design of Herstmonceux, with its patterned brick walls, turrets and bay windows, became a blueprint for palaces like Henry VIII's Hampton Court. The dissolution of the monasteries had laid the foundations for a new era, the age of the great British country house. Next time, I shall be visiting some of our greatest country houses, buildings which, in my opinion, have made a unique contribution to European civilization.